Loretta Anderson and Christine Swan, both nurses with the Department of Public Welfare, worked together as an on-site utilization management review team. Together, they conduct routine reviews of nursing facilities records. One day, while elbow deep in a review, they investigated the disturbance. The frustrated scream of an elderly woman led Loretta and Christine to the room of 83-year-old resident Mrs. Williams.
Hey, what's going on here?
Loretta, first to enter the room, saw an aide swear at Mrs. Williams and shove her down into her chair.
What would you do in this situation? I knew that I had just witnessed the abuse of a resident, and that called for immediate action. My first concern was for Mrs. Williams, so I knew I had to call someone who had the power to help her. I reported what I had seen to the head nurse on the floor and insisted that Mrs. Williams' physical and emotional conditions be assessed at once.
Once Loretta is sure Mrs. Williams is properly cared for, she reported the incident to the local Area Agency on Aging's Protective Services. Next, she reported the incident to the management of the nursing facility. Finally, she and Christine immediately reviewed Mrs. Williams' chart.
The chart revealed an inconsistency. Lab work showed irregularities in electrolytes and blood count, which indicated possible dehydration. This condition was not identified on the minimum data set. We were concerned about this inconsistency. We knew that the right thing to do was to file an official DPW report with the Department of Health.
From there, the Department of Health initiated a complaint investigation and classified the incident as a priority complaint. The department's Health Facility Quality Examiner conducted an on-site investigation of Mrs. Williams' condition and reviewed her chart, as well as the charts of other residents. Fortunately, Mrs. Williams was the only one with evidence of dehydration. Unfortunately, evidence indicated the same aide had abused Mrs. Williams before. The Department of Health then conducted an interview with Mrs. Williams.
2 days ago, in the afternoon, I wanted to take a nap. Now, I'm a little wobbly on my feet, so I need help getting from my chair to the bed. So I rang the call bell for help. The aides refused to help me. They claimed that sleeping in the afternoon would keep me from sleeping later that evening.
Mrs. Williams was adamant. She tried to get herself out of her chair. Her attempt was met with the same aide roughly pushing her back into the chair, leaving bruises on her arms. Mrs. Williams was ignored for the rest of the day, despite frequent call bells. Furthermore, Mrs. Williams claims she was refused liquids for a long period of time as punishment for her rebellious behavior.
I carefully documented Mrs. Williams' claims and included them in my investigation. Then I made 2 phone calls, one to the Department of Aging's Long-Term Care Ombudsman to inform them of the situation and of my on-site investigation. My call prompted the Ombudsman to visit Mrs. Williams right away. The other call focused on Mrs. Williams' allegations of abuse. You know, the liquids withheld and the rough handling. I reported the allegations to Protective Services.
When I received the call from Nina Redmond at the Department of Health, I told her that Protective Services had already begun investigating Mrs. Williams' allegations. This case required me to begin an investigation within 24 hours of notification of the alleged abuse. That notification came from DPW's UMR nurse, Loretta Anderson. As a Protective Services worker, I have access to records and residents at nursing facilities. My investigation included a visit to the facility and interviews with Mrs. Williams and the nursing facility staff. I also met with DPW's UMR team and the Ombudsman. Every time Protective Services receives a report of abuse, we inform the state agency that licenses the facility, in this case DOH. We also inform the Ombudsman. In this case, the Department of Health and the Ombudsman were already aware of the complaint.
The Department of Health and the Department of Aging's Protective Services each conducted a separate investigation. The Department of Health's purpose is to identify regulatory non-compliance that compromises the quality of care for residents.
In Mrs. Williams' case, Department of Health substantiated her claims, resulting in the termination of the aid. Department of Health issued several citations against the facility for violation of residents' rights and for the abuse and dehydration.
The purpose of the Protective Services investigation is to substantiate that some form of neglect, abuse, or exploitation has occurred. They investigate signs and symptoms of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and, if substantiated, act immediately to protect or remove the resident from the situation.
Our investigation confirmed that Mrs. Williams needed protection. A service plan, which is a plan of action, was created to remove the threat from her environment. Termination of the aid resolved the service plan.
The Ombudsman from the local area agency on aging conducted follow-up on-site visits, in-service training with staff, and addressed the next resident council meeting to reinforce the resident rights issues. Let's review the involvement of the three departments in this first scenario. During a routine utilization management review, nurses from the Department of Public Welfare witnessed a suspected abuse situation. Concerned first with the resident's safety, they immediately notified the head nurse. Then they reported the incident to the Protective Services unit at the local area agency on aging. Next, the DPW nurses detected a red flag when they discovered an inconsistency in Mrs. Williams' record. DPW reported the situation to the Department of Health, which investigated the incident. Department of Health informed the Ombudsman of their on-site investigation. DOH's investigation led to the termination of an aid due to behavior problems and the issuance of citations against the facility. The Pennsylvania Department of Aging was involved through the local area agency on aging's Protective Services investigation and by Ombudsman participation. Protective Services focused on a service plan for Mrs. Williams. The Ombudsman worked to educate the staff and residents about resident rights. Aging met with Welfare's UMR team and made sure Health was aware of their involvement. By working together, all three departments detected, then protected a resident from harm.